Shalom, I'm Mark Regev, speaking to you from the JNS studios in Jerusalem for another episode of Israel-Undiplomatic. And of course, as per usual, I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Blum. How are you today, Ruthie?
I'm pretty good, Mark, other than the protests that made us almost late for our broadcast, but we'll get to that in a minute. First of all, before we start, I'd like to ask our viewers, anybody who likes the content, to please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. And also to remind everyone that JNS is launching its inaugural annual International Policy Summit at the end of April 27th and 28th. And there's a little banner at the beginning of this video. You can click to register. Or on the JNS website, jns.org, there's also a box that you can click to register. So now let's get to it, Mark. I'm handing it over to you to start.
So we spoke last week, and you will recall that we said last week that the current situation is not sustainable. There was a ceasefire in place and no hostages were being released. And we both said that this is just, it can't go on. It has to break. Either Hamas releases hostages or Israel goes back to fighting. And it all broke out again on Tuesday night, where Israel surprised Hamas. We took out in that original strike, we took out a whole host of Hamas leadership, launching air attacks against the Gaza Strip. The Prime Minister spoke again last night. He said, it's not that we're not going to hold negotiations to try to get hostages out, but those negotiations will now happen under fire, and Hamas has to understand that we'll only be ratcheting up the pressure against it until it makes a decision to release hostages, and then we're ready for another pause. I think in this move, Netanyahu is being Nixonian in the positive sense of the word. I remember there was a time when the North Vietnamese were causing problems in the negotiations, and Nixon said, okay, let's bomb Hanoi, let's bomb them, let's make them pay. And I think this is the approach of Netanyahu today. Hamas didn't want to negotiate seriously. They came, according to the Americans, with all sorts of unrealistic demands. Okay, we put the pressure on. Military strikes against them, against their targets, against their leadership. And we'll see if that can move them a bit. I believe it's possible that we can.
Well, first of all, I just want to make a slight correction. It wasn't Tuesday night. It was Monday night. It was 2 a.m. Tuesday morning.
Correct.
And that contributed to the element of great surprise. I think it's important to stress that it's quite extraordinary that in the middle of a war, even though there was a ceasefire, we're still at war on many fronts. And the ability to actually take everybody by surprise, Israelis and Hamas and the international community by total surprise. The only, I would say, the only person who wasn't taken by surprise or administration was Donald Trump and his administration in Washington. This was coordinated very carefully with the United States. It didn't just happen suddenly. It was coordinated carefully, while the United States was also bombing Houthi targets in Yemen. So what you have is a kind of coordinated attack on two Iranian proxies, very important. And especially important since days before that, Hamas pulled a stunt, as it usually does, by saying, okay, we will agree to the Steve Witkoff proposal. What we agree to is to release the American hostage, Idan Alexander, and 4 dead bodies of the rest of the American hostages who were killed. And of course, in Israel, Netanyahu said nothing doing. First of all, you're not going to separate, you're not going to cause a kind of selection of, okay, only the Americans and what about the rest of the hostages? And anyway, it wasn't part of Witkoff's proposal at all. So Netanyahu said no to that. And thankfully, so did the Trump administration. They said, okay, no more playing games. We told you all hell would break loose if you didn't release all of those hostages. Now, they were, I have to say, Witkoff and Trump and Netanyahu were giving Hamas the chance to at least release, let's say, 10 hostages, some number of hostages, so that we could get the most out as possible. We believe that there are some 24 still alive out of the 59.
Up to 24.
Up to 24. We don't know. It could be fewer than that. But anyway, the point is that despite all this now, what has happened as a result of this, I think it's an incredibly important move. I had said to you, you're right. Last week we spoke about it. And I said, not just that it's not sustainable, but that, we have to do this. This is not a question of, if we just end the war, we can release all the hostages. If that had been on the table ever, it's possible that even I would say, well, listen, human life is so valuable. We really can't, those poor people were snatched from their homes and, we can't enable that. But that was never on the table. Hamas will never return all the hostages. And that we know. So anyway, Netanyahu was patient, Trump was patient, and at some point they were so patient that the rest of us were growing impatient. What hell is breaking loose? Nothing. Anyway, we were wrong, as often is the case, and the attack was launched. It was a severe blow Tuesday early morning. And now let's go to the response to this, the reaction.
And first, before we go to the reaction, I want to say that from Israel's point of view, I think this attack, us restarting the fight against Hamas is almost under optimal conditions for Israel. Obviously, when we were responding to October 7th, that was in response to Hamas's attack on us. This time, not only did we surprise them, which in tactical terms is a great achievement because we managed to get a lot of their senior leadership on that first night, their first strikes. But if you think about the overall what's happening in the region, you said, first of all, we're coordinated with the Americans, which wasn't always the case in the past, as we recall. Yes, the fact that we have a green light from the United States to do this has happened after the Trump administration has opened up arms supplies to Israel, materials that were being held back by the previous administration. And I think our military is now well equipped to do what we need to do. And then there's the overall geographic situation. The Americans, just as we are pounding Gaza today, the Americans are pounding Yemen, Houthi-controlled territory. The Americans have said to the Iranians that if the Houthis respond violently against American targets, they will face the brunt of America's wrath. It's almost like the 62 missile crisis in Cuba, where John Kennedy famously said any strike from Cuba will be seen as a strike by the Soviet Union against the United States. And so Trump has said that to the Iranians. Any strike now by the Houthis against American targets will be seen as a strike by Iran itself, and America will respond. Very powerful language, very powerful strikes, ongoing strikes now for a number of days now, and expected to continue until the Houthis back down. The situation in Lebanon is totally different from this time a year ago. Lebanon has been taken out of the war. Hezbollah is still there, but it's been defeated. It's being diminished. Its power in Lebanon is much reduced. It's playing defense today. Its leadership has been destroyed, as we know. The situation in Syria is totally different. Not that this new guy is a friend of the Jewish people, but it's not Assad. It's not part of the Iranian axis. And the Iranians, to a certain extent, are also playing defense. And so, in many ways, this was an opportune moment for Israel to take the initiative to relaunch our offensive. And I believe there's a good chance that we can succeed, not only in damaging Hamas, but through this pressure on Hamas to get Hamas to release some more of our hostages, which ultimately is an important part of our war aims. We want to see those hostages, as many of the hostages come home. And of course, we have to prioritize the living over the dead. We want them all out. But if people are alive, that up to 24, that's the official number. We say up to 24 live hostages still being held in Gaza. We want them out.
Right. Well, also, there's another element here. Everything you say is right, the timing, etc. But there's another crucial factor here is that Hamas, in all those, every day that we were not doing this, Hamas was rebuilding, rearming, recruiting more terrorists. It's got though we halted humanitarian aid trucks into Gaza, it doesn't matter because the Hamas had already amassed tons of food and other supplies. And so that wasn't real pressure on them. So now let's talk about pressure from other directions. There's pressure from the international community and from inside Israel. So let's start with the UN, with the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, a known sworn enemy of Israel's, who has spent this entire war bashing the Jewish state, pretending not to, but doing it openly. He went as far as, in the best of case, comparing us to Hamas on October 7th. In worst cases, putting us on a blacklist that even Hamas, he wasn't recognizing Hamas's rapes and other sexual atrocities. It was just horrible. So his reaction to this strike, these strikes on Israel's part was, this is outrageous and you're killing all these people. First of all, the numbers being cited are from the Gaza Health Ministry, that you can't trust its figures. Not
controlled by Hamas. Yes?
Of course it's controlled by Hamas. And anyway, they come out with body counts before it's even possible to count bodies. As we know, Israelis, unfortunately, we know what terrorism is. We know when there's a scene of a lot of dead people. Just counting them, it doesn't happen automatically. It's just so, A, that's lying. B, I don't care. If there were 400 or 4,000 people killed in Gaza. And you know why I don't care? Because not a single one would have to be killed. If Hamas laid down its weapons and released the hostages, they have to surrender and they have to do it. Now, they're not doing it. We see that because they would rather live in rubble. They would rather have their people live in rubble. Their big honchos are outside of Israel, living in the lap of luxury. They would rather have their people live in rubble while killing Jews than solve the problem. So I really don't care. What I care about is our people. And we were aggressed against. We continue to be aggressed against. Now, the rest of the international community, we hear from even friends in Europe. Friends, I say in quotes because a friend doesn't say that, right away condemning our actions. And it's a shame. The Arab world, even our Abraham Accords partners, the Arab world, we have Europe, everyone attacking us for this. How dare they? I would like to see them in this situation. That's number one. Now let's get to the internal problem.
Well, first, let's do the international.
Okay.
First of all, the UN Secretary General and that apparatus has an institutional bias against Israel, is obviously very clear, and we've discussed it before on this program, yes? I'd remind you that the same Secretary General who told Israel off for responding, to the fact that Hamas refused to release any more hostages, back in October 23, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks after that original atrocity, he already called for a ceasefire for, quote, humanitarian, unquote, reasons. Yes, he doesn't believe that Israel should have responded. Yes? I mean, it was only October. He had already called for a ceasefire. In other words, they can cross the border, they can murder, they can massacre, they can behead, they can rape, they can mutilate, they can take hostages, right? And Israel shouldn't respond. That's basically his position. Once again, October 2023, he had already called for a ceasefire.
Well, exactly.
And when there were some 250 hostages held in Gaza, and we wouldn't have had we agreed, had Israel been stupid enough to heed what the Secretary General of the United Nations said, we would never have got that first group of hostages out in November 23, and we wouldn't have got the hostages out. Hamas is only responding to pressure from Israel.
And it's not only that. Guterres actually had the nerve to say, that we have to understand October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum.
I remember that.
That's one thing. Another is that this insane, adherence to a dead issue, and that is two-state solution, a Palestinian state. So every statement comes out, no, what we need to do is have a ceasefire and negotiate a settlement so that there can be a Palestinian state. Forget it. Okay. It's not just Hamas. Let's not kid ourselves. It's Islamic Jihad. It's Fatah. It's the Palestinian Authority. Palestinians may not have a state, and they certainly may. If they want to have one on the moon, go ahead. Maybe Elon Musk can send them up there somewhere. No. There can be not that they want a state. They just want to kill Jews. But never mind that for a second.
I was in the middle of the same thing. I want to give you the good news, okay?
Yeah.
And the good news is, though, of course, whatever Guterres says is picked up by the media and it's broadcast, yes, but he's totally irrelevant. He is totally irrelevant. And you said before, the most important partner we have, the United States of America, right, has green-lighted the Israeli operation, has not only in words, but the fact that they're giving us, replenishing our supplies of munitions and so forth, and giving us the diplomatic backing at the Security Council and all that. That's the important factor. Guterres has made himself irrelevant, right? The UN, which is theoretically committed to global peace and you can't say brotherhood anymore. No, I don't know what the word you're supposed to say. Friendliness of nations together. Yes, they're totally irrelevant here. They've made themselves irrelevant through their own misdeeds and mistakes. And I don't think anyone in Israel takes the UN seriously on any of these issues.
Well, we take it seriously enough to have an ambassador to the UN and to have statements and responses to it. But can you imagine if Trump hadn't won this election? Do you realize we would have had an administration in Washington that is really similar to UN and in terms of its ideology? That would have been the end of us. I don't know what. Okay. We certainly would have had trouble winning this war. Now, but this does bring us to internal strife in Israel right now. And it's separated into more than one part here, because right before the surprise strike, that was Monday night and Tuesday at 2 a.m. But Monday evening, the protest movement, the anybody but Netanyahu movement, was now gearing up to start a new series of demonstrations, marching here, marching there, surrounding the Knesset, to protest the fact that Netanyahu announced he was firing the head of the Shin Bet, which is like Israel's FBI, Ronen Bar. Now, we don't have to get right now into the weeds of why that was necessary and that it was perfectly within his right to fire him. People tend to not realize there's a difference between appointed officials and elected ones. In any case, Netanyahu is Ronen Bar's boss by law, and he's allowed to fire him. That we have an attorney general who is anti the government and anti Netanyahu, who's supposed to be basically the government's lawyer, said, well, no, that's not, it may be legal, but it's not reasonable. And it's unbelievable. Our deep state goes after this. But so the protest movement used that as an excuse. You think they really care about this Shin Bet director or the other, especially since he was mainly responsible for not preventing the October 7th atrocities, not foreseeing them. That's his whole job. He had one job. Okay. Not foreseeing them and not preventing them. But okay. As long as he and Netanyahu are at loggerheads, that's enough for the protest movement. So then in the morning, when we woke up and saw that now there are these strikes on Hamas, finally, after all these days of ceasefire, the protest movement didn't say, okay, now it's not appropriate. We don't need to now go out to the streets. No, because they're protesting this. And meanwhile, another part of the protest movement is screaming, you're killing all the hostages by launching this operation. And then we have to talk about the difference between devastated hostage families and everybody who's worried that this is going to result in their deaths, which is different from protesting in the middle of a war against Netanyahu's move to fire the director of his security service that he needs to work with.
So, most of all, the protest movement over the last couple of months, and especially before the war, they used to yell out the whole time, democracy, democracy, democracy.
Huh.
And anyone who knows about democracy. He says there's elected officials and there are the government,
appointed ones,
appointed people whose job it is to implement the government policy within the framework of the law. And the law is clear on this. The government has the right, if they are unhappy with the head of the security services, to dismiss him. And the whole idea that it's somehow anti-democratic. Think of it in the opposite situation, where the head of the security services, who has a lot of power, right? His job is to keep us safe, and he has a lot of power that he has a lot of covert capabilities, yes? And the idea that he is stronger than the government, that's the opposite of democracy. It really is the opposite of democracy. In America, where you grew up, right, there was all these stories about Hoover, who'd been there like for decades as the head of the FBI and had too much power and no one could touch him, right? That's not democracy. Democracy is elected officials controlling the security services and being answerable to the security. And you can argue, right? Is Netanyahu doing the right thing or the wrong thing? That's legitimate. Everyone can have their opinion. But to say that he doesn't have the right to dismiss this guy,
and also to take to the streets, even after you see that we're soldiers, we're also gearing up the ground troops again. We are at war, and we're trying not to kill the hostages. We're trying to rescue the hostages, and they still need to go out and pound the pavement against the firing of Ronen Bar that they couldn't care less about. In fact, as I said, if he had been in lockstep with Netanyahu, they would be saying that he should be fired or he should resign, because they're all hypocrites. But let's talk about...
Hang on, but I wanted to respond to what you said about the hostage families. And this is one of the narratives that come out. It's not all the hostage families, but some of the very vocal ones picked up by the media, both in Israel and abroad. A hostage family saying this new Israeli offensive is dangerous to our loved ones, because they can get killed in the fighting between Israel and Hamas. An Israeli bomb could actually accidentally fall on them. Bombs could fall around them, and the Hamas people could decide to murder the hostages. In other words, that what Netanyahu is doing is endangering their loved ones. So as you said correctly, it's very difficult to argue with the families of people who've got hostages. If I was in their situation, I don't know what I'd be doing. Yes. But from the point of view of policy, right? I think, from anyone who looks at this closely, Hamas had a chance to release hostages peacefully in negotiations. There were all sorts of ideas on the table. Hamas didn't want to do it. I think actually there's always risk in everything you do, especially in armed conflict. There's always risk involved. There's risk to your soldiers. There's risk to your civilians. There's risk. Always there's risk. If you want a no risk policy, you've got to go live in, I don't know, in Denmark. And maybe that's also risky today. Yes. But in the framework of calculated risk, what we're doing at the moment has, I think, a greater chance of bringing hostages alive home than the alternative, because you're basically telling Hamas, you can't keep holding these hostages. You will pay a price if you continue to hold these hostages. And I think that is a way to get people out. And to ignore that reality is to ignore the fundamental truths when you're dealing with a brutal, ruthless, extremist, fanatical terrorist organization like Hamas, which we've all seen what they're capable of doing. You think you're going to be nice to them and they're going to be nice back, that they'll, give them a ceasefire and give them more ceasefire, they're suddenly going to release people? No way. They'll pocket the ceasefire and use it to rearm and plan future attacks. You've got to keep on the attack. You keep the pressure up. And once again, I think it's the position of the Israeli government. They get a pause. They get a timeout if they release more hostages. If they don't, the pressure keeps up.
Right. Now, you pointed out that not all the hostage families are on the same page, and that's true. Most people don't realize that there's a whole bunch of hostage families who disagree with the main group that is protesting and is always on television and going abroad. These are people who say that only maximum pressure has a chance of releasing their loved ones. Okay. So, but again, as you said, we don't know how we would feel. But I will stress, it's possible that if I had a child in Gaza, I wouldn't care if we sold Israel down the tubes or America down the tubes or a whole world just to get my child. But a mother's love and tears do not make policy. Okay. And it's possible I would feel that way. Some people feel that way. You think I don't feel that way when I send my kids in to fight in Gaza? I could say the same thing.
You don't send them. They're sent by the army. And
I could,
yes.
First of all, I don't send them. That's true. The army sends them. But I could be like these mothers going out and protesting it. We've seen that there's been mothers' movements. There were during the Second Lebanon War, where you protested and you're endangering my child. But here's the thing that we have to stress again and again. And by the way, it is true the hostages are endangered. Let's not kid ourselves, okay? We're not trying to be in denial here.
Every day they're in Gaza.
Every day they're in Gaza. Yeah. They're endangered. They're starving. They're being purposely starved, etc., and tortured. And it is true that our bombing or our actions could cause the various captors, to execute them, or they could be killed in a strike, an Israeli strike. It is possible. We know that. This is an impossible situation for us. But here's another impossible situation. Not defeating Hamas completely and finishing the job this time for once and for all means that A, all the soldiers died in vain. B, all the thousands of bloodthirsty terrorists we release from jails who re-offend again and again and who have vowed to commit October 7th atrocities again and again, they endanger us. And they also endanger the freed hostages. Well, who says that these people who are free now won't be slaughtered in a Palestinian terrorist attack when they're going to the mall to buy a new outfit? Okay? And but furthermore, you leave Hamas in power, it's like leaving any terrorist group in power that's why we are also fighting in Judea and Samaria against the terrorists there. We're all endangered, and there are now, we know, a certain finite number of people in Gaza, but we have a bigger number of future graves and future rape victims and torture victims just waiting to happen.
So here's the problem with that. First of all, I agree with what you've just said. Every time you release a hostage, all the data shows that there's a good chance, that prisoners who are released, terrorists who are released from Israeli jails, there's a high proportion of them return to terrorism and they kill people. And the best example is Sinwar himself, the former leader of Hamas, who commanded the October 7th operation, massacre. He was released from an Israeli jail in the framework of a previous release. And unfortunately, he's not the exception. There are many, many like that. And there is a risk when you release terrorists to get your people back. Now, what's the problem? And I think it's a very human and understandable problem. You have a name, you have a face, you have a picture, you have a very specific, tangible person who's now in Hamas captivity, and you want to get him out. The names and the faces of anyone who's going to be killed in the future as a consequence of that release, it's much more amorphous.
That's true.
And you don't have it's much, much, much more difficult. And I think that's always going to be the situation. I'd also remind you of another factor, that Israel has committed itself to rebuilding those destroyed communities along the Gaza frontier, all those kibbutzim and other communities that suffered so much on October 7th. I mean, there are communities there that like a third of their people were either killed or taken hostage, and so forth. I mean, you've got a whole series of communities that there's going to be it's already started, a massive national effort to rebuild and to replant. And that's ultimately, in my opinion, the victory of Zionism. We took a serious hit, but we will rebuild our country. We'll repopulate the area. We will make these communities a thriving communities. Victory, what is real victory for Israel? That Israelis will want to move to those communities because they are successful communities, because they are thriving communities, because there are communities where there's quality of life for the people who live them. Now, what chance have you got to rebuild those border communities if Hamas stays in power? It's just not going to happen. No one will agree to live there. And everyone will know that there's just a ticking stopwatch. We're just waiting for another October 7th because Hamas will use any period just to consolidate its power, to retrain a future generation of terrorists, and we're going to live in total expectation of another October 7th. It's crucial, and it's one of the war aims. Hamas does not stay in power in Gaza when this is over, and this is something we cannot compromise on. When this is over, Hamas is ruled by someone other
No,
than
Gaza,
Hamas.
not Hamas.
Gaza, sorry. Gaza is ruled by someone other than Hamas.
So, first of all, it's ironic then that the people who want to rebuild the southern communities, the Gaza border communities, many of them are protesting and saying we should end the war, or go to phase 2. Now, I would like to clarify to people who don't seem to understand what phase 2 of the ceasefire deal really means. Phase 2 means Israel exits Gaza, exits the Philadelphia corridor that's between Egypt and Gaza, exits completely. The army goes out and Hamas remains in power. That's why Hamas wants to move to the second phase. Now, anybody who's from the Gaza border communities who watch their loved ones being slaughtered and raped and burned and isn't able to go back yet, or their houses have been destroyed, some have gone back to live there, how they can support going into phase 2 of a deal that actually enables those murderers, baby killers, to be along there just a few hundred meters from their fence is beyond me. All right. That I don't get. But, there are all these paradoxes here. I don't understand how they can support it.
They say that they get all the hostages out and then you can go in there and, take care of Hamas. But to think that Hamas would be stupid enough, first of all, you said quite correctly, the chances of Hamas ever releasing all the hostages, that's their, to use a monopoly from the game we used to play as children. Yeah, that's the get out of jail free card, right? The chances of them actually releasing all the hostages, I think that is a very difficult proposition for Hamas to voluntarily give up everybody. But secondly, the idea that Hamas would be stupid enough, Hamas are crazy, but they're not stupid. And we've seen how clever they can be in the October 7th operation. They are evil, clever people. The idea that somehow they would have a situation where they'd agree to do something knowing that once they've done it, Israel could go back, that they wouldn't be able to finesse it in a way that would tie Israel's hands, I think is to minimize the brains you associate with your enemy. And that is a classic mistake. To think your enemy is an idiot and it's dangerous.
Well, it's the idea that got us to October 7th in the first place. The idea that somehow your enemy, you're not seeing what you're seeing. It's unbelievable how blind we were. Not all of us. I'll say we, but I have to say, I never believed it. I never believed in any of these peace processes and land for peace. So I don't include myself in that. But Israel tended to, I'm very critical of the people who made these peace deals, etc., in Israel. But I will have to say, Israelis want to get along with it. We want to get on with our lives. We want to build things. We want to have high tech. We want to do all those things. We're not in the business of killing people, despite our enemies' accusations. We're not in the business of killing people. We're in the business of actually going to parties like the Nova Festival. We're in the business of having kids and going to the mall and having holidays. All right. And so we cannot stand the idea that we have to live by the sword again and again and again and again. And we keep trying to think, but if we just give them money, or we just give them work permits, if we just have peace, if we give them land, it always ends in bloodshed. So the idea now that I'll tell you, people have said, if the hostages aren't returned, Israel will never be the same. Now that's possible. Or we will not have won the war. But if Hamas remains in power, even a vestige, and if the Palestinian Authority has anything to do with Gaza, even a little bit, Israel will never be the same. And if you think now we have to live by the sword, oh boy. So, ironically, or I don't know, Trump who came out with that, I'm going to turn Gaza into the Riviera. Actually, that would enable residents of the South to go live at home peacefully and step across the border to go shopping maybe, or to get their hair done. No. As I said, people laughed at Trump and said, this is outrageous and it's not possible. But you know what? At least it has an eye to actual peaceful relations and flourishing economies. So I don't know what the solution is, but I can tell you one thing. We cannot leave Gaza. The military cannot until we finish the job.
Ruthie. Number one, you said about living by the sword. I think anyone who knows anything about international relations, yes, Israel will be living by the sword for the foreseeable future. But it's not just Israel. You had all these Europeans who thought the world's moved on and we don't need armies and we don't. America has to have a sword. Every country has to have a sword. The idea that somehow, we're all going to live in some sort of Garden of Eden and we can all just, brotherly and sisterly love. It's not the real world, yes, and especially in the Middle East. For the foreseeable future, even serious peaceniks, and there are some, will tell you that, yes, we can make concessions because Israel is strong. And we have to be strong. And it's an illusion to think otherwise. We have to have a sword. It has to be sharpened. It has to be ready to meet any challenge. We have to be ready to go. But I wanted to finish with a good story that we didn't mention. It's an economic story, which will be good for both of us, yes? Because we might end up paying less taxes. There was a deal announced, was it yesterday or the day before, of an Israeli cyber company called Wiz that was bought by an American giant for $32 billion US. It's the largest ever sale of an Israel high-tech company. Once again, the largest ever, right? And it's going to bring a lot of money into the Israeli treasury through the taxes that the sale will make. And apparently, we are going to pay less taxes in the coming year because of the taxes the government's going to get from, not that we're going to pay less tax, but we were supposed to pay more taxes, apparently, to finance all the costs of the war. And I think this is ultimately, why is this good? It's not just good for you and me, Ruthie, because we'll hopefully not have another tax increase on us, but it's also a sign of confidence. This is what Israel strength is about. It's not just our brave soldiers in the field who are willing to risk their lives to protect the country, right? It's not just the thousands of Israelis who volunteer for all sorts of organizations to make sure that this country is what it is, but our high-tech sector, right, is amazing. And this is the engine that is driving Israel. And Israel's nexus with technology is making this country. We are going to be one of the most successful countries in the 21st century, precisely because we've embraced the future, we've embraced technology, we've embraced entrepreneurship. And this sale this week, right, the largest ever sale of an Israeli company to an international buyer, in this case an American buyer. It's a vote of confidence in Israel and in Israel's future. It's a $32 billion vote of confidence.
It is. Well, I would just like to end on that is a positive note, and that's wonderful. But I would like to end on a less positive note about that particular issue, and that is the protest movement. Many of them are in high tech. And you know what they said? Oh, because of Netanyahu, the international community won't invest in us and we're isolated. We're taking our money out of the country. So what I say to them is, good. Take your money out of the country. You unpatriotic, I don't know what. Okay. Because the truth is a lot of those people, all the people you're talking about are entrepreneurs. We're out there protesting, and shame on them. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Wiz founders aren't among them. And all I want to hear from all of those is appreciation for the country that gave them the opportunity to engage in creative thinking and entrepreneurship. But you won't hear that. You won't hear that from them.
Can I just, we should have finished. We've gone over time, but I will say the following. Yes, Ruthie, to say that all the high-tech people, there were a number of very loud high-tech people who were very much opposed to the government. But to say that they're all there,
I didn't say all. I didn't say all.
You cast an aspersion on an entire sector, okay? And I think it's like saying all the people at universities are like this, all the people.
If the shoe fits, Mark.
Yeah, but I think one should be a little more careful in casting aspersions on entire communities.
I didn't say all. They are known for it. They are part of an elite stratum of Israeli society, and they tend to do that and be part of that. I didn't say all.
Well, it's like they say that all Tel Aviv people are like that when you're a Tel Aviv person.
But all academics at Tel Aviv University are suspicious.
I'm sure you can find.
Sorry. You can find one or two who have to keep silent so that they don't endanger their tenure.
And I think on that note of Ruthie expressing her very, very strong opinions, we will say farewell until next week.
Well, what's a podcast for if not for opinions? Yes, looking forward to it, Mark.